The cannon shouldn't have fit. It was massive, brutal, designed to punch holes through armored aircraft at 20,000 feet. Now it sat bolted to a plywood boat barely longer than a coffin. The wood groaned under the weight. Salt water seeped through every seam. And somewhere in the darkness of the Philippine jungle coast, Japanese engineers stood back and asked themselves the same question everyone would ask when they saw these things: what kind of desperation builds a weapon like this? This is the story of how Japan took American fighter plane cannons and mounted them on boats, so small they could hide in shadows. They called them suicide boats. The Americans called them something else. They called them devil boats. And for a few terrifying months in 1944, these floating coffins became the most feared thing in the Pacific night. But this story doesn't start with boats. It starts with a crash. The P-39 Airacobra came down hard in the jungle near Rabaul. The American pilot never made it out. Japanese recovery teams found the wreckage 3 days later, half buried in mud, vines already crawling through the shattered cockpit. They weren't looking for the pilot. They were looking for the gun. The 37mm autocannon mounted in the nose. It was still intact. Barely. One of the engineers, a man named Tanaka whose hands still shook from malaria, knelt in the mud and ran his fingers along the barrel. It was longer than his arm. Heavier than anything they had left. He looked at his commanding officer and said something that would echo through every coastal base from New Guinea to Leyte Gulf. "We can use this." They didn't know it yet, but they just found the blueprint for their last desperate gamble. By mid-1944, Japan was drowning. Not in water. In inevitability. American forces moved like a tide, island after island, cutting supply lines, crushing defenses, pushing closer to the homeland with mechanical certainty. Japanese commanders watched their maps shrink. Their fuel reserves evaporated. Their aircraft fell from the sky faster than factories could replace them. Pilots launched knowing they wouldn't return. Soldiers dug caves knowing they'd become tombs. And in the coastal bases, where engineers and boat crews waited for orders that made less sense every day, a new kind of mathematics took hold. The mathematics of sacrifice. Traditional naval doctrine was dead. Japan's great battleships were burning at the bottom of the Pacific. Their carriers were gone. Even destroyers had become too precious to risk. But the Americans still had to come ashore. They still had to send landing craft through shallow water, past reefs, into bays where big ships couldn't follow. And that's where desperation found opportunity. That's where someone looked at a wrecked fighter plane and saw not failure, but transformation. The first prototype was built in secret at Rabaul. They stripped the 37mm cannon from the P-39 wreckage, cleaned it, tested it with ammunition scavenged from their own dwindling stocks. The weapon was designed to fire through a propeller shaft, to punch through engine blocks from half a mile away. Now they needed to mount it on something that could barely support a man. The engineers sketched designs on whatever paper they could find. Cigarette boxes. The backs of supply manifests. Blood-stained field maps. They argued in whispers, knowing their superiors would either call them geniuses or shoot them for wasting resources. The boat they chose wasn't even military. It was a fishing vessel, maybe 15 feet long, wooden frame, designed to drift quietly through coastal waters hunting tuna. They reinforced the bow with metal plates stolen from a destroyed tank. They built a crude mounting system using welded steel and rope. The cannon sat forward, angled slightly up, like the horn of some mechanical demon. Behind it, barely protected by a thin metal shield, sat the gunner. Behind him, exposed to everything, sat the pilot. There was no armor. No backup systems. No way to aim except by turning the entire boat. When they test-fired it for the first time, the recoil nearly tore the vessel apart. The wooden frame cracked. The pilot was thrown backward into the water. The gunner's nose broke from the concussive blast. But the shell hit the target. A rusted oil drum 200 yards offshore. The 37mm round punched through it like paper, kept going, detonated somewhere in the jungle behind. The engineers stood on the beach, ears ringing, watching smoke curl from the barrel. Tanaka was smiling. Not with joy. with something darker. Recognition, maybe? The recognition that they'd created something terrible and necessary. Something that couldn't win a war but might slow down the inevitable just a little longer. What happened next changed everything. Word spread through the coastal bases like fever. Engineers at other stations heard rumors. Impossible rumors. A fishing boat with a fighter plane cannon. A weapon that could sink a landing craft with one shot. Commanders desperate for anything, any advantage, any way to bleed the Americans just a little more, sent urgent requests. Send us the plans. Send us the weapons. Send us anything. The High Command, buried in their Tokyo bunkers, saw the reports and made a decision that would seal the fates of thousands. They authorized mass production. Not of boats. Of the concept. Use whatever you can find. Whatever washes ashore. Whatever the jungle gives you. Mount the biggest guns possible on the smallest boats possible. Crew them with whoever volunteers. Or whoever doesn't run fast enough. They didn't call it a suicide mission. Not officially. But everyone knew. The boats had no radios. No navigation equipment. Barely enough fuel for one attack run. The crews would hide in mangrove swamps during the day, covered in mosquito nets, breathing shallow, watching American patrol planes circle overhead like vultures. At night, they'd push their boats into black water and wait. Wait for the sound of engines. Wait for the shadows of landing craft moving toward shore. Wait for their one chance to matter. Please like and subscribe to help us share more forgotten World War II stories. The second wave of Devil boats used different weapons. Some had 20mm autocannons from destroyed Zero fighters. Others mounted multiple heavy machine guns, synchronized to fire in devastating spreads. One ingenious engineer at Mindanao found a cache of old coastal defense guns, ancient things from the previous century, and somehow mounted them on reinforced barges. The recoil was so violent that crews had to tie themselves to the boat just to fire. But they fired. And when they hit like the fist of an angry god. American intelligence first encountered these boats off the coast of Leyte. October 1944. The invasion was going smoothly. Too smoothly, maybe. The landing craft moved in formation, methodical, following doctrine. Marines inside checked their weapons, adjusted their gear, smoked last cigarettes. The sun was setting, turning the water orange and gold. Beautiful, if you ignored the smell of burning oil and distant explosions. Nobody saw the devil boats until they were inside the formation. They came from nowhere. From shadows. From inlets too shallow for American ships to patrol. Small, fast, suicidal. The first landing craft didn't explode. It just stopped. Like someone had turned off its engine. Then the water around it turned red. The 37mm round had entered through the bow ramp, traveled the entire length of the vessel, and detonated near the engine. 17 Marines died before they even understood they were under attack. The devil boat didn't try to escape. It turned, lined up another shot, fired again. Missed. The third shell hit another landing craft just below the waterline. This one did explode. Fuel tanks ruptured. Men on fire jumped into water that was also on fire. The surviving landing craft scattered, breaking formation, trying to identify the threat. But the devil boat was already gone. Swallowed by darkness. By the time American destroyers responded, shelling the coastline with 5-inch guns, the boat was miles away, hidden in a river mouth, covered with palm fronds, its crew breathing through wet cloth to hide their breath in the humid air. The Americans called in air support. Patrol boats. Destroyers moved closer to shore, risking reefs and mines. They found nothing. Or worse than nothing. They found pieces. Scraps of wood. A torn fishing net. Bloodstains on a beach. But no boats. No weapons. No bodies. It was like fighting ghosts. Ghosts with anti-aircraft cannons. The third encounter was worse. A week later, different island, same tactic. But this time the devil boats came in groups. 5 of them, coordinating without radios, using prearranged signals. Flashes of light. hand signals visible only to each other. They waited until the landing craft were committed, too far from the troop ships to retreat, too close to shore to maneuver effectively. Then they attacked from multiple angles. The noise alone was terrifying. The 37mm cannons made a sound like metal tearing, like the sky breaking open. Tracers lit up the water. Explosions turned the surf white with foam and red with blood. 2 landing craft sank. 3 more were crippled. And the devil boats vanished again. 1 was hit by return fire, disintegrated in a ball of flame, crew and all. But the others escaped. Melted back into the jungle. Became invisible again. This was the moment everything went wrong for American invasion planning. The devil boats weren't just a nuisance. They were disrupting the entire rhythm of amphibious assault. Landing craft couldn't approach shore without risking ambush. Schedules slipped. Marines sat in cramped vessels for hours longer than planned, sweating, vomiting, watching the coastline and imagining shadows. Morale suffered. Not because the devil boats were effective at stopping the invasion, they weren't. Japan was still losing. Still dying. But they were effective at something worse. They were effective at making every approach to shore feel like a gamble. At turning routine operations into terrifying uncertainty. American commanders responded with overwhelming force. They always did. They shelled suspected hiding spots until the jungle burned. They sent patrol boats into every inlet, every river mouth, every shadow where a devil boat might hide. They dropped depth charges in shallow water just in case. They napalmed entire stretches of coastline, turning mangrove forests into ash and blackened stumps. The smell alone was enough to make men sick. Burning wood. Burning flesh. Burning everything. And still the devil boats kept coming. Not every night. Not predictably. But enough. Just enough to keep everyone afraid. But they didn't know what was waiting ahead. The Japanese engineers had improved their designs. Third-generation devil boats used faster engines, scavenged from patrol boats and fishing vessels. They added crude armor plating around the gunner position, not enough to stop bullets, but enough to deflect shrapnel. Some boats received modified depth charges, designed to be dropped while passing landing craft. The charges would sink, detonate beneath the hull, rip through the bottom like claws. Crews trained in darkness, navigating by starlight and memory. They learned to move through water barely deep enough to float, using tides and currents the Americans didn't understand. They practiced firing their cannons in fractions of seconds, knowing they'd only get 1 shot before return fire turned their boat into splinters. The psychology of the crews was complex. They weren't all fanatics. Some were. Some prayed before every mission, wrote death poems, tied headbands with rising sun symbols. But others were just tired. Exhausted. Men who'd watched friends die in 1,000 different ways and had stopped believing in victory. They climbed into their coffin boats not because they wanted to die for the Emperor, but because dying quickly in an explosion seemed better than dying slowly from starvation or disease or American flamethrowers. Some crews drank before missions. Sake when they could get it, which wasn't often. Homemade liquor that tasted like gasoline. Anything to steady the shaking in their hands. One crew, based on a nameless island that doesn't appear on most maps, kept a journal. The pilot wrote it, in pencil, on pages torn from a school notebook. The entries are brief. Factual. October 15th. Engine failed during approach. Drifted 2 hours before repair. No contact. October 18th. Fired 3 rounds. 1 hit confirmed. Boat damaged during retreat. Gunner wounded. October 22nd. American patrol boats searching our position. Remained submerged underwater for 20 minutes. Thought we would die. The final entry is dated November 3rd. Tonight we attack the main formation. If you read this, tell my sister I was brave. The journal was found by American Marines 3 months later, wrapped in oilcloth, hidden in a cave. The boat crew was never found. The casualties among devil boat crews approached 100%. Not immediately. Not always during the attacks. But eventually. Always eventually. Crews that survived their first mission rarely survived their third. The boats themselves were disposable. Unseaworthy. They leaked. Engines failed. Wood rotted in the tropical humidity. But there were always more boats. More cannons. More desperate men willing to climb aboard because the alternative, waiting on shore for American artillery, seemed somehow worse. American intelligence tried to understand the threat. They interviewed captured crew members when they could find them, which was rare. Most Devil boat crews chose death over capture, either from wounds or by their own hand. But occasionally someone survived. Washed ashore unconscious. Too injured to resist. The interrogations revealed the pattern. The boats were organized in small cells, 3 to 5 vessels each, operating independently. No central command. No coordination beyond the local level. Each cell chose its own targets, its own timing. This made them nearly impossible to predict or prevent. You couldn't cut off the head because there was no head. Just dozens of small, desperate groups, scattered across hundreds of miles of coastline, each making their own choice to attack or wait, or die trying. What happened next nobody expected. In December 1944, as American forces prepared to invade Luzon, Devil boat attacks intensified. But something changed. The boats started using new tactics. Instead of hit-and-run ambushes, some crews attempted ramming attacks. They packed their boats with explosives, pointed them at landing craft or small warships, and accelerated to maximum speed. Human torpedoes. Floating bombs. The first successful ramming attack destroyed a patrol boat off Lingayen Gulf. The Devil boat hit at 20 knots, detonated on impact, killed everyone on both vessels instantly. Pieces of wood and metal and human beings rained down across 100 yards of ocean. The blast was so loud it was heard 12 miles away. The Americans realized they weren't just fighting boats anymore. They were fighting a philosophy. A weaponized form of desperation that turned every small craft, every fishing boat, every piece of floating debris into a potential threat. You couldn't sink all of them. Couldn't predict which ones were armed. Couldn't know which innocent-looking vessel was actually crewed by men who'd already decided to die. The psychological impact was enormous. Sailors on patrol boats started shooting at anything that moved in the water. Fishermen. Floating logs. Shadows. Anything. The stress broke men. Some refused to approach shore. Others shot first and never asked questions. War crimes happened. They always do. But they happened more when everyone was afraid. The Japanese High Command saw the success of the Devil boats, and made a terrible decision. They would expand the program. Mass-produce these suicide vessels. Thousands of them. Station them around the home islands. Use them as the first line of defense when America inevitably invaded Japan. The plan had a name, Operation Ketsugo. The final defense. It involved thousands of Devil boats, tens of thousands of suicide planes, millions of soldiers and civilians armed with bamboo spears, all committed to a single goal: make the invasion so bloody, so costly, so horrifying that America would negotiate peace instead of demanding surrender. Engineers across Japan began converting every boat they could find. Fishing vessels. Pleasure craft. Anything that floated and could carry a weapon. They trained crews by the thousands. Teenagers, mostly. Boys who should have been in school. Old men who should have been fishing. They practiced in darkness, in storms, in conditions that killed them during training more often than during actual combat. But the program continued. Because what else could they do? The empire was dying. The home islands would be next. And in the logic of total war, in the mathematics of desperation, the Devil boats made perfect sense. Trade one life for 10. Trade certainty for chance. Trade a clean death for the possibility of taking enemies with you. But the Devil boats had a weakness. The same weakness that doomed every desperate weapon. They required desperation. And desperation has limits. Crews began deserting. Not many. Not openly. But quietly. Boats would fail to return from patrol, not because they'd been sunk but because their crews had simply disappeared into the jungle or the night. Commanders responded with harsher discipline. Executions. Public displays meant to terrify others into compliance. It didn't work. Or it worked just barely. Just enough to keep some crews fighting. But the psychology was fracturing. You can order men to die. You can even convince them to die willingly. But you can't do it forever. Eventually, the human instinct for survival overwhelms even the strongest indoctrination. This was the moment the Devil Boat program began to collapse from within. American forces invaded Luzon in January 1945. The Devil Boats attacked in waves. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. Nobody knows exactly how many because the chaos was total. They came at night, as always, but this time in coordinated groups larger than anything seen before. Some carried cannons. Some carried explosives. Some carried both. The American response was apocalyptic. Destroyers fired star shells that turned night into day. Machine guns from 100 different vessels created overlapping fields of fire. The water turned white with tracers, red with explosions, black with smoke. Devil boats exploded, disintegrated, burned. Some got through. Some hit their targets. Landing craft sank. Men died. But not enough. Never enough. The invasion continued. The beachhead held. And by dawn, the Devil Boat fleet was gone. Destroyed. Scattered. Burned to ashes floating on an oily sea. The survivors retreated to coastal caves, to river hideouts, to anywhere the Americans wouldn't immediately find them. Some crews tried to rebuild. To repair damaged boats. To scavenge new weapons. But the supplies were gone. The fuel was gone. The ammunition was gone. And slowly, one by one, the crews themselves were gone. Killed in American artillery strikes. Captured during cave-clearing operations. Starved when supply lines collapsed completely. Or simply dead from disease, from exhaustion, from the cumulative weight of months living in humid caves breathing mold and fear. The last confirmed Devil Boat attack occurred in March 1945. A single vessel, identity unknown, attacked an American supply ship off Mindanao. The boat managed to fire 2 rounds before being obliterated by return fire. 1 round missed. 1 round hit, killing 3 sailors and wounding 7 more. The Devil Boat and its crew ceased to exist in a fraction of a second. The American ship continued on its mission. The supply line never stopped. The invasion never slowed. And somewhere in the darkness of the Philippine coast, the last Devil Boats rotted in their hiding places, their crews either dead or vanished, their cannons rusting, their wooden hulls dissolving back into the jungle that had briefly sheltered them. After the war, American intelligence compiled reports on the Devil Boat program. The official documents are dry. Statistical. They estimate between 50 and 70 Devil Boats were constructed. They estimate crew casualties at over 90%. They estimate American losses attributed to Devil Boats at approximately 200 killed, 400 wounded, multiple vessels sunk or damaged. The numbers are precise. Clinical. They tell you what happened but not what it felt like. Not the fear on both sides. Not the desperation that built these floating coffins in the first place. Not the strange, awful creativity that looked at a crashed fighter plane and saw salvation. Not the humanity of men who climbed into boats knowing they wouldn't climb out, not because they were insane but because the alternative felt worse. Some Devil Boats were never found. They disappeared during the war and stayed disappeared. Maybe they sank in storms. Maybe their crews sabotaged them and walked away. Maybe they're still out there, buried in silt, covered by decades of jungle growth, their cannons rusting into nothing, their stories known only to whatever fish swim through their rotting hulls. Occasionally, even now, fishermen find pieces. A corroded engine block. A metal plate with Japanese markings. A cannon barrel so rusted it barely resembles a weapon anymore. They pull these things from the ocean or the river mud and wonder what they are, what desperate hands assembled them, what final moments these objects witnessed. The P-39 Airacobra that started it all, the crashed fighter whose cannon became the blueprint for Japan's last gamble, was never recovered. The jungle claimed it. Within months it was invisible beneath vines and new growth. Within years it had rusted into fragments. Somewhere in the mud near Rabaul, pieces of that aircraft still exist. The cannon that was stripped from it, that was mounted on a fishing boat, that fired perhaps a dozen rounds before the boat was destroyed and its crew killed, that cannon's fate is unknown. It might be at the bottom of the Pacific. It might be buried on land. It might have been recovered by scrap metal collectors decades ago and melted down, transformed into something peaceful, something that has no memory of war or desperation or the strange mathematics that turns fighter planes into boat weapons. What remains is questions. Always questions. The Devil boats were militarily insignificant. They didn't change the outcome of the war. Didn't slow the American advance more than a few days, a few hours. They were a footnote. A curiosity. A desperate improvisation that briefly troubled an inevitable victory. But they mattered. They mattered to the men who built them, who crewed them, who died in them. They mattered to the Americans who faced them and learned that desperation makes different rules. They mattered because they represent something larger than tactics or technology. They represent the moment when a nation, an empire, faced its mortality and responded not with surrender but with transformation. With creativity born from necessity. With violence born from the absence of alternatives. The engineers who designed these boats, men like Tanaka who knelt in jungle mud and saw possibility in wreckage, most of them didn't survive the war. Some died in Allied bombing raids. Some starved. Some were executed by their own commanders for various real or imagined failures. A few survived. They went home to a Japan that no longer existed, that had been burned and rebuilt, that wanted to forget everything about those desperate final years. They never spoke about the Devil boats. Not publicly. Some wrote memoirs decades later, brief paragraphs buried in larger histories. We did what we thought necessary. We were wrong. The war was already lost. But we didn't know how to stop. The words are simple. Almost apologetic. They don't capture the smell of the jungle, the weight of the cannon, the sound of wood cracking under recoil, the faces of teenagers who would never become anything other than ghosts. The American sailors who faced the Devil boats went home too. They told stories. Bar stories. Stories that got bigger with each telling until they became legend. Boats the size of canoes carrying guns the size of howitzers. Kamikaze pilots on water. Japanese supermen who could navigate in absolute darkness and hit targets with one shot. The truth was smaller and sadder. The truth was fishing boats and desperation. But the legend persisted because the fear had been real. The danger had been real. And in the economy of memory, fear matters more than facts. Modern historians debate the Devil boats. Some call them a war crime, a violation of the laws of naval warfare, suicide weapons that blurred the line between legitimate combat and terroristic desperation. Others call them a reasonable response to overwhelming force, a guerrilla tactic no different from partisans or resistance fighters using whatever weapons they could improvise. Both arguments miss something essential. They miss the human element. The choice that wasn't really a choice. The moment when you're handed a weapon too big for its platform, pointed at an enemy too strong to defeat, and told that your death might matter, might slow them down, might buy one more day for people you'll never meet to do something you'll never see. And you climb into the boat anyway. Not because you're a fanatic. Not because you want to die. But because all the other options have been exhausted or taken away or destroyed, and this small, terrible choice is the only one remaining. The P-39's cannon wasn't designed for boats. It was designed for altitude, for thin air, for dogfights between aircraft moving at hundreds of miles per hour. Mounting it on a wooden fishing boat was absurd. Impractical. The recoil alone could break the vessel. The weight destabilized everything. The logistics of ammunition, maintenance, and operation in a saltwater environment made no sense. And yet it worked. Not well. Not reliably. But enough. For a few months, in a few desperate places, it worked just enough to matter to the men involved, to create fear in their enemies, to write a footnote in history that most people have never read. If you found one of these boats today, intact somehow, preserved in some impossible way, what would you see? Wood. Rust. A weapon too large for its platform. Metal plates welded badly. Rope bindings. Evidence of hasty construction and desperate improvisation. You'd see engineering decisions made not in clean labs but in jungle clearings by men whose hands shook from malaria. You'd see the marks of tools that barely worked on materials that barely held. You'd see, if you looked carefully, the bloodstains that salt water and time couldn't completely erase. And maybe if you were quiet enough, if you listened in the right way, you'd hear echoes. The sound of wooden hulls moving through black water. The mechanical click of a cannon being loaded. The breathing of men who knew this was probably their last night on Earth but climbed aboard anyway. The final moment before firing, when everything goes silent, when the world contracts to target and weapon and the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this will matter. But nobody preserves devil boats in museums. They weren't honorable enough to memorialize. Weren't successful enough to celebrate. Weren't sophisticated enough to study. They were built from wreckage, crewed by the desperate, and destroyed by overwhelming force. They existed in the gap between surrender and annihilation, in that strange space where logic stops working and only survival matters. And when the war ended, when Japan surrendered and the killing finally stopped, the devil boats became an embarrassment. A reminder of how low the empire had fallen. How far a great naval power had declined when its last weapons were fishing boats with stolen cannons. The Americans who encountered them rarely spoke about the fear. Combat veterans don't usually. They talk about the action, the tactics, the outcome. But not the fear. Not the moment when you're approaching shore and you absolutely know, that somewhere in the darkness ahead something is waiting. Something small and fast and impossible to see. Something crewed by men who've already decided to die. And there's nothing you can do except keep moving forward. Keep following the plan, and hope that if it comes, if the darkness suddenly lights up with tracers and the sound of that distinctive cannon, hope that it's not your boat, not your friends, not you. That's the part that stays. Not the statistics. Not the after-action reports. But the fear. The knowledge that desperation makes its own weapons, and those weapons don't follow the rules. Somewhere in military archives, in boxes labeled and forgotten, are photographs of devil boats. Not many. The Japanese didn't document their desperation proudly. But some photos exist. Grainy. Black and white. Showing wooden boats with metal protrusions, sometimes with crews visible, sometimes empty. The men in the photos, when visible, look tired. Not heroic. Not determined. Just tired. They stare at the camera with expressions that are hard to read. Resignation, maybe? Or just exhaustion. The kind that comes from living in a jungle, eating rotten rice, breathing mold, and knowing that tomorrow or the next day or soon, very soon, you'll climb into that boat and either die quickly or die slowly but definitely die. The photos don't explain anything. They just show. Here's a boat. Here's a cannon. Here are men. The context, the desperation, the philosophy that created this thing, that's invisible. That exists only in the space between what's documented and what's real. The story of the devil boats is the story of the war's end. Not the diplomatic end, not the signatures on documents, but the psychological end. The moment when one side realizes they're beaten but continues anyway because stopping feels impossible. Because momentum carries armies forward even when logic says retreat. Because individual men make individual choices that collectively become history, even when those choices are constrained by circumstance and fear and the absence of good alternatives. The devil boats didn't change history. They were changed by it. They were created by desperation, fueled by it, destroyed by the same overwhelming force that created the desperation in the first place. They're a cycle. A loop. Proof that war creates its own logic, its own weapons, its own victims. If you want to understand the devil boats, don't think about tactics or technology. Think about the moment of decision. The moment when an engineer looks at a wrecked fighter plane and makes a choice. The moment when a teenager who wanted to be a fisherman is handed a death sentence disguised as a mission briefing. The moment when commanders, safe in their bunkers, make abstract decisions that become concrete for men they'll never meet. The moment when fear becomes normal, when danger becomes routine, when death becomes the expected outcome rather than the avoided one. That's where the devil boats exist. Not in the physical world of wood and metal and gunpowder, but in the psychological space where desperation transforms into action. The war ended. The devil boats didn't change that. Nothing could have changed that. Japan was beaten by August 1945, beaten so thoroughly that the only question was how many more would die before surrender. The atomic bombs answered that question in a way that made devil boats irrelevant. Made suicide planes irrelevant. Made the entire philosophy of desperate resistance irrelevant. You can't improvise a defense against atomic weapons. You can't hide from them in coastal caves. You can't train teenagers to pilot fishing boats against them. The scale had changed. The mathematics had changed. And suddenly, in that terrible flash of light, the devil boats, and everything they represented became obsolete. But for a few months, in a few desperate places, they existed. They were real. Men built them. Men died in them. And men on the other side, men who survived and went home and tried to forget, learned something about what desperation looks like when it floats toward you in the darkness carrying a cannon designed for the sky.